So many people are talking about server components, especially with Next, but did you know that Next.js actually has server components too? It's an experimental feature, but it's really cool, and I'm going to show you how to use it, some things I ran into, some things that work great, and then we're going to create a small little application. So we're going to create a recipe creator, so where you can create an AI-backed recipe creator only for authenticated users, and it's all going to be using Next.js with server components and API routes. And it's going to be backed by Amplify and our predictions category, which allows you to do text-to-speech, speech-to-text, and other AI tools. All right, I have the documentation open, and it has a whole section on standalone server components for Nuxt. And let's go ahead and go through that configuration to get it up and running. Now, before this video started, I created a brand new Nuxt application. I added some folders. I'll talk about that later, but really hasn't been configured. I also added in this CSS here. If we look here, you can see here there's a whole experimental section. And there's a whole bunch of experimental components, but the ones we care about right now is component islands. And if you look inside the documentation for Nuxt or on GitHub, you might see it called islands or component islands. So this is another name for this server components. Now it says the way to work it is you actually put .server.vue for your files. So I thought I would do that. I created a components folder, and I'm going to create a new file. Let's call it Erik.server.vue. And I'm just going to create a empty file here. By the way, this is just a snippet I have that adds this in here. And we'll go an h1 hello from server component. Right here in this index file, I created a pages folder and I added an index.vue. Before we started, I also added this Nuxt page in here. That way we can access it rather, because I wanted to have routes. So if we go back to index.vue, I should be able to import this in. Now, real quickly, if you've never used Nuxt before, be careful. Don't do an import like this. This is the first thing I did accidentally. I tried to import in the Erik component from /components/Erik. If you do it like this, it will not work. The server component won't render correctly. So the way you want to do it is, since we are using Nuxt, we have automatic component imports. So all we need to do is just do something like this, Erik. And if we did this correctly, we'll go into our app on localhost 3000 and we'll refresh it. And it'll give us an error the first time. So I think we need to stop and restart it. So it might give us an error that the Nuxt server component island is missing. If that happens, just go ahead and stop the server and restart it. Cool. All right. So we see here, hello world. Now we have hello from server component. Now this isn't very interesting right now, but it looks like to be that it's running. Now, one way we can determine if it's a server component, other than maybe looking at the network tab that we'll do in a moment, is to see how it works with interactivity. So with server components, you don't have the DOM, you don't have the Windows object, you don't have the document object. You also don't have like lifecycle hooks that you normally would have in a normal Vue application. So to test this out, I can try something like this. I'm going to import in ref from Vue, and then I'm going to create a counter. And we'll put it at 0. This is like basically what you see in all the documentation everywhere. We'll create a new button component. We'll call it update counter. And then we'll add an @click handler that will just do counter ++. And now we have this new update counter, but if you click on it, you can notice it's not working. And that's because this is rendered on the server. We don't have this, this type of interactivity doesn't work. It's not going to work here at all. One way to fix it is to pass in via props the counter, and then I'll show you what it does. So rather than having it in here, let's go back to the index.vue file. Well, let's go back to the Erik server file. And let me just kind of copy and paste a few of these out of here. We'll go with the index.vue, and then we'll go back to the server, and we'll put them right under the component here. And we'll take the counter out there. So we'll go back to the Erik component, which by the way is not very well, it's not a great name for it, but for our sake of this demo, it's fine. And we'll use our good old define props. We'll assume that we're going to get a a TypeScript string here. So we'll call it counter. It's type string. And now we should be able to access it in here. But if we go back to our index view, now we need to pass it in. Now it's not giving us an error. I've noticed this sometimes with my VS Code editor. Sometimes I have to like reload it or reload TypeScript. But it should give me an error because this server now requires this prop. It's not there it is. So you can see here, it's a little right squiggly line. If you put over it, essentially if you read this, it's missing the prop. So now I can pass in counter, and I'm just going to pass it in like this. Actually, if I go back to the Erik server, it's expecting a string, but really, let's do a number here. So if I did this right, now this counter is now inside the server component, and I can even make this a little bit more, I don't know, let's do some inline styles just for the heck of it. Okay, and so this is our counter here. Now if we click update counter, it's now updating as we expected. So we were able to pass values in from the basically from the root into this server only component. And if we come back here to our network tab, which is right here, and if you hit update counter, you can see it's updating here at the bottom. And if you look at a little bit more detail, look at the payload, it's basically sending the props down. It's reloading this whole server component every time we do this. This is a very simple example, but one thing that I was really interested in is how can we, instead of passing in values as props, is there like a better way of doing this? And so let's take a look. So one thing that would be really handy for something like this is to use slots. So that way, if we want to interact with our component here, that anything between the opening and closing brackets could be passed into it. So let me see how that works. So if I come back here, and I put Erik here, I can come back into the Erik server component, and I can add in a slot. And typically you just do something like this. It says slot, and you can have the default values in here. I know, hello world, or hello from slot, and save it. And if I go to the app view, or go back to my index view, and then I refresh it here I see the hello from slot. And this seems to work. If I want to pass stuff from the parent component to the child component, you would expect that I can just pass things in through this slot. So like right here, hello world from parent. And if I do that, you notice it doesn't work. And this is something I was trying to figure out, why doesn't this work? Because I looked at the official documentation and the GitHub for this project, and it mentioned that they have now added this feature in. So what I needed to do, and you might have the same issue, is I had to actually name this. Even though it's a default, I had to actually add default in here. If I did that and I refreshed it, you could see now I see hello world from parent. But if you come into the app, you get this hydration children mismatch in div. So what's happening is that there's some sort of lag between the time the server component loads and the data from the client loads. So in other words, if we come back to this index.vue file, this is being rendered via SSR, server-side rendered, meaning it's partially being rendered on the server and then sent down to the client, and the client rehydrates. And what I'm thinking is that this value doesn't get entered in until later in the life cycle, so you get this hydration mismatch, which at first you think, well, it just gives you this warning, but it pretty much breaks your app once you get a hydration mismatch. Like for example, all the routing breaks. So this is kind of a big deal. I did find a workaround for this, and if you know a different workaround, leave a comment below. What you could do is you can have server components, but you can also add in client components. So I'm going to take this Erik server view, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to rename it to erik.client.view. And so you can have, and I'm going to stop and restart the server. So now what's going to happen is it's going to load the server component first, and then it's going to load the stuff on the client. So it's almost like it's back to being a server-side rendered app. But if you do this, the hydration mismatch disappears, and right away it says hello world from parent. I'm not sure I really like this solution to do it this way. I think at this point, like I said, it kind of defeats the purpose of these server components, but they are experimental, and I'm assuming like little issues like this will be fixed in the future. But it is a little bit interesting, like this doesn't quite work the way I expect it to. And just for the heck of it, I'm gonna go back into the index file, and I'm not gonna worry about the entering this data in here for slot data passing in to the server. So I'm back, everything's working again. Now, one other issue that I kind of found, and since this is experimental, I'm sure they're thinking of new ways of doing this. This server component loads soon as the app loads on like the initial page load. And if I go into the server component here, let's say I want to add in a timeout of some kind. So let's try this. We're going to await a new promise. And that's going to be async. We're going to resolve. This is kind of just a quick way of setting promises. So I'm going to set timeout. That's going to resolve to hi. But we're going to have it every, I don't know, 5 seconds. So what this is saying is as soon as this loads, and this is run on the server too, by the way, so that way we don't have to put this inside like a mounted hook or anything. So as soon as the server loads, it's going to run this promise. It's going to take 5 seconds. So if I kind of click refresh here, you can see it's 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. So it loaded. And if I come back to like this recipe route, which I'll talk about this in a second, and come back to home, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. So if you have any long running async promises to like a server to like an external server in your component, it's going to basically halt the whole loading of your route, which is a pretty big deal, which means it's kind of unusable for one of the big features you'd probably want to use it for, which would be to actually like connect to databases and do things like that. I know that in the future there are thinking about adding in like suspense. Like I tried trying to add suspense, like surround this whole Erik block by suspense. If you don't know, suspense is a way that you can have like fallbacks and loading spinners for async components. We really need something like that. In the Next world, you can actually create whole files in your components folder. You can create a loading file and like an error file. So when these async server components are running, like you'll see a loading spinner or you'll see an error if it fails. So I think that's definitely something that's needed for these server components to be really useful. But I'm really just happy that Nuxt is experimenting with things like this. There's even talk about form actions. So if you've used things like SvelteKit or in Next server actions, there's a big push to add in these kind of server actions on the Nuxt side. And that would add some really cool features to be able to have forms that submit directly to server actions instead of having to create your own API. What I kind of want to show you then, instead of trying to use like a server component to connect to a server, which was the original idea of this video, I thought maybe instead of doing that, I'll show you how you can use API routes and use a way to talk to a server to talk to create basically a recipe application using OpenAI's ChatGPT. And then we're going to use Amplify's text-to-speech to be able to read that out, which I think is kind of a neat feature, neat way to add Amplify. And we're also going to add in something called authentication, so only authenticated users can use it. So what I want to do for this app is I want to get it up and running on our Amplify system, AWS Amplify, which has a whole bunch of features for authentication, managed GraphQL, but it also, some people don't know, it has this predictions category that has some really neat features for like text-to-speech, speech-to-text, even has some AI features. So to get started here, I'm going to run, first I'm going to install, if you don't already have install, I'm going to run AWS Amplify /CLI TAC-G. And this will install the Amplify CLI globally so you can use it. And then of course you'll have to have an AWS account. And then I'll do you can sign up for a free account if you look for AWS free tier. I'm gonna run Amplify init, and this is going to basically configure this app so it can work with AWS Amplify. And I'm just gonna say yes here. I'm gonna use my default profile, and this will just take a moment. Okay, so it went ahead and generated like some scaffolding, so now we can generate and provision the rest of our backend that we want to add in. So we're gonna do one thing here. We're gonna Amplify add predictions. And so if you look at the official documentation, this is a cool category of really neat tools that you can use for your app. Like I said, they have text recognition. You can do text recognition for images, converting text to speech, entity recognition, interpretations of text, transcribing text. So it's kind of a neat feature that I think not enough people know about. So we're going to do, it's going to be convert. And it asks us, we need to have Amazon Cognito. So we're going to add auth. We're going to do default configuration, email. I know I'm done. So this is basically creating our user pool and identity pool so we can have people log into our app. And it's going to ask us a few questions down here. We can translate text in different places, translate text into different languages, generate speech audio from text is what we want. And I'm just going to leave the default name, and we're going to stick with US English. And it gives us a bunch of different profiles, different voices we can use. I don't know. I'm going to use Ivy. I've never used this one. I'm going to make it so only authenticated users can access it. Well, we'll do auth and guest users just for now. Doesn't really matter. And if we go Amplify status, we could see we have now provisioned this for auth and predictions. I'm going to run Amplify push, and the tag Y just says, it gives me like, are you sure you want to do this? This Y says yes, and this will go ahead and create all the provisioning in the background for Amplify. Great, so I went ahead and created the whole application, provisioned everything in the background that we needed. It uses Amazon Poly for the speech to text, or text to speech in this case. And now we need to do a little bit of configuration. So let's start with the Amplify file. So in this folder structure, I created a new plugin. Well, first let's update the Nuxt config. So I'm gonna open up the Nuxt config, and there's a couple of things you need to do to get Amazon Amplify working with this. This is in the documentation too. So we're gonna do alias here, and I'm gonna copy and paste this from another screen. And this essentially just makes so it can find everything. By the way, this is not going to this is maybe in the future. This is definitely going to be changing. You won't have to add these things in, but today you do. It's just a weird quirk with using Vite and AWS Amplify. So this essentially will add in our aliasing and define. And now we can go in and we're going to create a new Amplify folder. Not Amplify, but plugins folder. This Amplify folder was created for you when you did the Amplify init and added the resources. You can actually kind of see them here in the back end as the predictions category. So if I go to plugins, I created this new file called Amplify TS, and this is where I'm going to enter in the Amplify configuration to get this working. So I need to import a few things. Amplify and auth from AWS Amplify. And then one really important thing is we'll add in this Amazon prediction provider. Now it's giving me a squiggly line error, but for now we can ignore this. It should work. We'll import in an AWS Amplify UI view styles.css. And then we'll import in the AWS exports file. Now this is a file that was created when we created the Amplify init. And now we have this export define next plugin. So we need to amplify.configure, and then we pass in the AWS exports file. And then this is a little bit weird here, but I'm going to do amplify.predictions here. And I'm going to check to see, and it's actually amplify.predictions. And then I'm going to check to see if this identify pluggables.length is true. And if it is, then I'm going to do amplify add pluggable new Amazon AI prediction provider like this. And then we can provide, this is just a way to add auth inside your app. Okay, so if we did this right, I'm going to stop and restart the app. And I'm going to go back to our local host. I'm going to refresh it. Oops, I forgot one thing. We need to install a few libraries. We're going to install AWS Amplify, AWS Amplify UI Vue, and also OpenAI. And so these are the dependencies that we'll need for this application. All right, so the app is up and running. I did find the issue with the Amplify. Just make sure that you have like I was using an older version of Node. I updated Node 18 and did an npm install again, and everything is fine. So we should be all set here. Now the next thing we want to do is see if we can use our recipe route. So I created this recipe route. If I look here, and just over the sake of speediness, I added some code in. So I created a few util functions to kind of format the text. But what we're doing is we have a form here. We have an input that you input ingredients, and then you submit it. And when you submit it, it sends it on to this API recipe route, which I'll show you in a second, which will send the ingredients over. And then when we retrieve it back, we kind of we send it to this play function, which I haven't implemented yet. And then we also format the text so that way it'll look really nice. And then we'll display the text down here. And then I created this very simple formatting. So what this does is it takes the text that's outputted from OpenAI, because we're going to be using OpenAI with ChatGPT, and it just kind of formats it and creates a little bit of HTML in it. Very simple HTML, so that way we can display it on the screen. Obviously, if this was a production app, this is more of a hacked way to do it. I'd probably do something different, but this is fine for the recipe part of it. So what we want to do is, as soon as it gets the information back from ChatGPT, I want to do this play. So what I want to do here is I want to use the new predictions output. So I'm going to try that out. I'm going to have a res here, a response. I'm going to wait, and then we're going to have this new predictions, and we're going to run convert on it. And I'm going to make sure I have this predictions imported in from AWS Amplify. And it has this object that it's asking a few things. So first, one is called text to speech. So it asks for the source of the text. I just have text in here, and that will be the text that we passed into the app to the function here. And then I can put what voice ID I want on here. I think voice ID, there it is. And we'll do, I think it was called Ivy. And now once that response comes back, I'm going to do an audio here. We're going to create a new audio. And then we'll do audio.source equals the response. Now you can see here it's already typed for us, so we know it gives you the speech, and it gives you this URL of basically the translation it did. And then I'm going to run play. So what this should do is once we get the data back from the API, it'll use this, it'll play it for us, and then it'll display it on the screen down here with this text. Now to show you what the back end looks like, I created this new, we're calling it recipe post. And this is really simple. I created a utils auth folder. So in my utils auth, all this does is I have a .env file where I have an organizational key and an API key, which then I put inside here, and then it just runs the configuration. So in the post file, I run this create completion, and I'm just have a very, very simple prompt. If you've been interested in OpenAI, this is probably, if you were doing them once again in production, you'd have a much more complicated prompt. There's some best practices for that if you look at the OpenAI documentation. But what I'm essentially doing is just grabbing the data back from the read body of the event, grabbing the text out of it, sending it to the prompt, and then sending back the first choice. And that's pretty much it. So if this works, I should be able to show you. So let's say we wanted to create a salad. So we're going to use cucumbers, I don't know, greens, avocado, and let's say we want to add a little bit of some eggs. So I'm going to hit enter here. This is loading.
Avocado index salad with cucumbers. Ingredients: 2 cucumbers, peeled and chopped. 2 cups of greens.
Awesome. We've now created a recipe application. One last thing is, what happens if we wanted to like surround this and only have authenticated users be able to see this? So let's do that. Let's import in the authenticator from AWS Amplify UI View. And then down here in the template, I'm just going to add in authenticator here. And anything between the opening and closing brackets of the authenticator will only show if you're logged in. So if I do this, and then I also, what's really nice too, is I can add in a template here, and I can add in, and then I'll move this code in here. Okay. So if I did this right, I should be able to log back out too. So I'm going to create a new account, and I'm going to check my code that I got. All right, here I'm logged in now, and my recipe creator is here, so I can test it out again. Let's create a steak, oranges, apples, and we'll say cucumber. Let's see what kind of recipe it creates for us.
Apple steak salad. Ingredients: 1 pound steak, 2 oranges, peeled and sliced.
Okay, I'm gonna click sign out. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a comment below. And if you guys like Nuxt, I have a couple more videos you could check out here.